In the early 80s, Nintendo, a then almost 100-year-old Hanafuda card turned toy company who'd found some success in arcade games, took a risk on video game home consoles, a dying industry after the video game crash of '83. Almost single-handedly, this risky investment revived and kick-started the video game industry as we know it today. Years later, they took a risk on handheld gaming with the Game Boy, a market in which they've never placed second since. After that, Nintendo pioneered 3D games, which may have been less risky because who didn't want that, but it was nevertheless incredibly important. And when their 3D console successor wasn't as popular as they'd hoped, rather than just follow suit with the other consoles, they risked it all by doubling down on motion control with the Wii. And then once again, its successor disappointed in the market, and Nintendo risked it all by coming back from their biggest commercial failure, the Wii U, and making the first home console handheld hybrid that, had it flopped, you may have finally seen Mario show up on your Xbox down the road. But the Switch is shaping up to be their biggest home console success yet, and certainly the best consistent performance and good mind share they've garnered in the public eye in decades. And here we are, 4.5 years into that console, and I finally can say that I see them acknowledging the rewards from that risk and doubling down on it. Let's talk about it. I'm now the dad of a 5-month-old, and even before having a kid of my own, one thing that I'd heard lots of parents say is once you finally feel like you have a tactic to keep your kid in line or appeased or entertained or something, you've got about 2 weeks before it stops working and you gotta find a new one. I've already seen this a couple of times with my daughter, but I think the same is certainly true in business, in technology, especially, and most pertinently, in the video game space. Another example, I lived outside of the United States in Belgium between the years of 2004 and 2010, and whereas when I left, Nickelback was really well liked by most. I came back and they were the butt of every joke at my college. I couldn't understand why at first. They sounded exactly the same. But that was the point. You need to risk to grow and move forward, and sometimes you need to risk to stay relevant, or at least to stay exciting. And this isn't the first time we've said this on this channel, but this is the first time I've started to see a glimpse of the realization of this conversation. It's been pointed out before that Nintendo especially tends to cycle in twos. The NES and SNES, Game Boy Color / Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, N64 and GameCube, DS and 3DS, Wii, Wii U. In most of these cases, the first was highly innovative, and the follow-up was an often less original and less successful response to the first. This isn't inherently bad, and recreating your whole brand every new hardware cycle is both exhausting and probably ill-advised. When we find a thumbnail structure that people seem to respond to, it's wise to keep subsequent similar videos based around the same ideas. Theming and consistency are important, but you certainly got to pick your battles. The easiest example is the common one, that Nintendo knew the Wii was a success, but just didn't seem in touch with the market for the things they were lining up for the Wii U to see that their interest just wouldn't really be there when it came out to the degree that it existed for the Wii. I'm sure hindsight is 20/20, but now they have that same hindsight to glean from as we do. And in the September Direct of 2021, if you can call it that, check out AJ's video that went up at the same time as this one after this video to hear what that means. But in the Direct in September of 2021, it was solidified in my mind that Nintendo is in fact doubling down on risky, innovative decisions in the best way possible. Really, the biggest indicator was in the form of a small pink puffball, Kirby. Although we do intend to make a video all about this game, especially as a follow-up to our videos about Kirby, especially 3D Kirby in the past, a full deep dive will have to wait. But I'll start by saying this. I wouldn't know if it's coincidental timing or truly intentional, but Kirby's first truly 3D adventure, coming out just over one full development cycle after the Switch has been out and selling like crazy. There's a lot of subtext there, but paired with several other games telling the same message, it's no coincidence. Nintendo is fully aware of the success of the Switch, but this time they're not going to put out their proverbial fourth identical Nickelback album. They're getting ahead of the trends to not coast on their momentum, but to further propagate it. I mentioned that there are several examples, and there are, but Kirby's the first one really to look at. The last mainline game in the series was Kirby Star Allies on the Switch. And if you don't know anything about this game, I'll say this much. Some diehard fans love this game because it encapsulates so much of the content from across the series that it feels like a love letter to the fans of most enemies, allies, power-ups, and more. But in the majority opinion for non-fans and a large group of the fans themselves, the gameplay itself seems to suffer from this best of mentality. Long story short, the game's boring. Despite that, the game sold really well, at least for a Kirby game. It's the second best selling in the series after the original, and largely because the Switch sells well and everything on it has such a huge opportunity to thrive, sometimes despite itself. And its huge commercial success, even if not critical, would have been an easy opportunity for Nintendo to entice the team at HAL Labs to tweak the formula, to fix potholes, slap some band-aids on it, and put out the next game to continue in a fairly familiar footstep, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. To be honest, I think this is exactly what Nintendo of the Wii era would have done with this same dataset. But you know as well as I that wouldn't push forward Kirby as a franchise, and it wouldn't push forward the Switch's hardware either, sales or otherwise. If you didn't buy a Switch for Star Allies, there's little chance you would for Kirby Moon Enemies or whatever. That said, that could have been a safe and reasonable decision to make. But they didn't make it. Instead, they're making Kirby and the Forgotten Land and pushing the franchise into a new area it's never been, which, based on the excitement around the game, is obviously already completely paying off. And here's a quote from Nintendo President Furukawa from 2019, when this game would have been in early development, that I think is pretty pertinent. He says, "I don't want our developers to think too much along the lines of, what should I do if we fail? My most important role is to facilitate an environment in which they can demonstrate their own abilities. I'm not a pro developer myself, so I leave the actual development to leaders that can tell what a good game is and what isn't." There is a changing of the guard happening in Nintendo. Breath of the Wild with Fujibayashi, Miyamoto taking a step back, even Sakurai with his team at Bandai in some ways. And I'm sure a ton more that I'm forgetting or we just don't know because it's behind the scenes. But I mentioned there's more, and there certainly is. Kirby was just the game that solidified this for me. Right now, Nintendo seems to know that their sales are doing great across the board and they have money in the bank, so they can risk using some of those funds for projects that are more ambitious and hope for the best. Furukawa similarly commented about Animal Crossing, saying that although they had confidence in the game, they had no expectations that it would perform as well as it did. They've got resources to spare, and here's how they're using them. Metroid Dread, another incredibly evident example. Based on Metroid's sales track records, never breaking 3 million sold for any of its games, coming in far under that for all Metroid games in over a decade, it would be easy for Nintendo to want to ease into this series, test the water, and hope they'd be surprised. And honestly, that's one of the most Nintendo things I can imagine, and something they're legitimately notorious for in the past. When various projects have been announced, fan expectations are for them to make the game on a smaller budget, market it enough, but not much, and base future viability of the franchise off the success of a well but humbly made and marketed game, ultimately shelving it once again. Think Chibi Robo or Hey Pikmin and several more. And this is what third parties like EA especially did with games like FIFA for the first years of the Switch. This is what one could expect from Metroid Dread, but especially for a 2D, more mature, targeted game to be marketed and developed with this much care shows that Nintendo is not dipping their toes in the water, but diving in head first. Some more examples are like from a video I made after the E3 Direct, where Nintendo is using third-party studios to revive IPs like Advance Wars, Famicom Detective Club, Metroid, Pokemon Snap. As we see from Nintendo's own library of dormant franchises, it's easier to not revive an IP than to do so. But the thing we've all been screaming at them for years now is that they may never have a chance like this again for F-Zero or Star Fox to reinvent themselves and find their own new audience. So it really is now or never. And thankfully, they seem to be choosing now. A retort you may have is that Nintendo has already been doing this. Breath of the Wild was a huge risk, and so was Mario Odyssey. And while I might agree in some ways, I thought of that argument myself, I feel like there is a clear distinction between launch risks and continued risks. Mario Odyssey arguably wasn't that much of a risk anyway, I guess. It was huge and awesome, and the return to form that I loved and wanted, but kind of safe in that everyone was very vocally wanting that for years, and it delivered. It was great. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, was such a departure and was a huge risk in that way. But it certainly didn't stem from the success of the Switch and wasn't part of any kind of pattern, but rather just the best decision made in all of gaming of all time, somewhat siloed from any other conversation. Nintendo may not always make all the decisions we'd like them to make, but there is a level of being in touch with their audience that feels true today in a way that it hasn't in a long time. They are used to making decisions and pushing on full steam ahead, assuming that people will come along for the ride. But after some tough lessons, their leadership seems to know that while they'll always have fans who will want to hop on, it's not a bad idea to let them backseat drive just a bit every once in a while, and to keep mixing it up, because no risk, no reward, right? So in my analogy from the beginning, as a dad, Nintendo is the parent and we're their child, I guess, and our wants, hopes, and dreams keep growing and changing because we're growing and changing ourselves. But here in 2021 and onwards, Nintendo is finally being responsive and reactive to what would excite, surprise, and entertain. Let's see if they keep up the pace, but for now, I'm loving what I'm seeing. But that's what I think. What do you think? Is Nintendo taking risks, like I'm saying here, in your opinion? And what would be one risk that you think would be really great for them to take that you also think would pay off well? Let me know all that and more in the comment section down below. And when you're done watching this video, which now you are, pretty much, go watch AJ's video that also went up at the same time as this one, also on our channel, linked in the description right below, right under this video, and also it should be in the end card as well. So go check out that video, but also be sure to subscribe to fanatixfour, and again, we're testing out different release date structures for our videos, but it's always 2 videos a week. So be sure to ring the notification bell so that you can get notified for the videos themselves so that you don't miss them, because we don't know exactly what times they're going to be going up for a little while. We're just testing some stuff out. So I appreciate you sticking with us through all that. But yeah, be sure to like the video, comment, and subscribe. And we'll pull some of those comments to talk about on our podcast this weekend, which will go up on Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern time. Thanks so much for watching. Peace and blessings.